In an unprecedented and profoundly moving moment, President Ibrahim Traoré and the iconic comedian Eddie Murphy met for the very first time. An encounter that began with casual cheer soon took a deeply emotional turn when President Traoré shared a personal narrative that left Murphy utterly unprepared. The events that unfolded next left everyone present in a state of shock. Traoré's moved Murphy to tears. This remarkable meeting stands as a testament to how respect, genuine sincerity, and unforeseen vulnerability can forge powerful connections between human beings. The air inside the hushed hotel conference room had been electric with amusement. When Eddie Murphy made his entrance, the celebrated comedian had arrived for what he anticipated would be a relaxed discussion with African leaders, centered on the influence of art and narrative. With cameras documenting the proceedings, the atmosphere was light and convivial. But seated opposite him was a man whose very presence altered the room's dynamic. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Youthful, unassuming, and poised. Traoré welcomed Murphy with a firm handshake and a smile that seemed startlingly authentic. Eddie told a quick joke, and the room filled with laughter. However, the look in Traoré's eyes held a gravity that stopped Murphy's own chuckle short. Then, without any forewarning, Traoré leaned in and spoke with a soft intensity. "Can you comprehend what it is to begin life with absolutely nothing yet bare? The weight of needing to give your all." The room fell silent. Eddie's smile vanished. He had not seen this coming. The cameras continued to record, but for the first time in a very long while, Eddie Murphy felt a knot form in his throat. An intuition told him this would be no ordinary exchange. President Traoré went on, his voice unwavering but thick with feeling. "When I was a child," he started, "I witnessed my mother toil from dawn until dusk simply so we could have one meager meal. She never uttered a word of complaint. Her only prayer was that her children might one day live in a nation where human dignity was a fundamental right, not an unaffordable privilege." Eddie drew closer, his typically jocular expression now replaced by one of profound empathy. Traoré paused, then met Eddie's gaze directly. "Today, as president, I look upon those same children's holus, starving but still able to smile. And I ask myself, am I truly doing enough for them? Will I be remembered by history as a leader who genuinely cared, or as just another figure?" Holding power, the conference room was completely still. Even the film crew appeared motionless, as if hesitant to breathe too audibly. Eddie shifted in his chair, a clear sense of unease on his face. This was not material for comedy. This was unvarnished truth. His chest tightened as he muttered, "Wow, I was not expecting this." Traoré simply acknowledged him with a nod. "I wasn't either, but there are times when the truth refuses to be delayed." Eddie Murphy struggled to regain his composure, but his voice quavered when he finally managed to speak. "You know, for decades I've made the entire world laugh, but listening to you, I feel as if I've never posed the truly important questions to myself. Have I contributed enough? Have I leveraged my influence to make a real difference?" Traoré moved nearer. "Eddie, laughter brings healing, but past the laughter, the world is in need of courage. And sometimes the courage to show you care can transform lives more profoundly than any joke." For the first time in his celebrated career, Eddie Murphy wiped away tears on a live recording. A collective gasp went through the room. He whispered almost inaudibly, "You are reminding me of the reason God blessed me with this ability. It wasn't just for entertainment, it was for service." Traoré rested a hand on his shoulder. "In that case, perhaps this is not merely a meeting. Perhaps this is the beginning of something much larger." Those words seemed to pierce Murphy's very soul. He was no longer the only one weeping. Many in the room, including members of the camera team, had tears running down their faces. The world had just seen the first fissure in Eddie Murphy's iconic smile. It wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of his humanity. The laughter that had once animated the room now seemed like a distant echo. Eddie Murphy remained motionless, his familiar grin absent, as he listened with rapt attention while President Traoré's words lingered with an undeniable weight. Traoré's composed voice possessed a gravity that no one could dismiss. "I did not come here with the intention of impressing you, Eddie," he stated gently. "I came to convey the reality of my people, a reality the world all too often prefers to ignore." Eddie swallowed with difficulty, his eyes shimmering with tears. He attempted to ease the tension with a smile, but it failed to materialize. The cameras continued their work, capturing every subtle shift of emotion. Traoré spoke again. Each morning I see children in the streets whose dreams are far greater than the food in their stomachs. And each night I am left to wonder what more I can possibly do to ensure they have a future worth embracing. The silence was profound. Even the audio technicians seemed to fidget uncomfortably. For the first time in many years, Eddie Murphy wasn't the one captivating the room. He was the one being deeply moved. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees. His voice, usually so vibrant and full of life, was now barely audible. "You know something, man. I have been blessed beyond what any person deserves. I've helped people laugh when they felt they could never smile again. But hearing you speak, I have to question if I've really done enough. Have I given back in the way that I was meant to?" Traoré's expression softened. He didn't offer a quick response. Instead, he placed a hand over his own heart. "The worth of a man isn't measured by what he accumulates, Eddie, but by what he gives away. And giving isn't always about material wealth. It is about giving your heart, your presence, and your courage." Eddie bit down on his lip, battling to hold back his emotions. The cameras moved in closer, documenting the raw, unscripted nature of a moment no one could have predicted. "Brother," Eddie whispered, "I feel like you've just touched on something I've been avoiding for years." Traoré nodded in understanding. Sometimes the truth just waits patiently for us to be ready to listen. The audience, though quiet, felt an almost tangible energy in the room, as if they were present for a historic event, not just an interview. The emotional weight of the moment finally became too much for Eddie Murphy. He lowered his head into his hands, and for the first time in decades, he wept openly in front of an audience. A collective gasp rippled through the room, but no one dared to move. President Traoré leaned in, his voice tender. "Do not feel shame. For your tears, Eddie, they are the evidence that your heart is still very much alive." Eddie slowly lifted his head. His face was wet, but his spirit had been touched. "Man, I came here assuming I would be the one to bring the laughs, but you've given me something far more profound. You've reminded me of what it truly means to be human." Traoré offered a faint smile. "And perhaps this is the moment where laughter and truth converge, not for the purpose of entertainment, but for healing." Even the camera operators had tears in their eyes. What was meant to be a cheerful meeting had transformed into a once-in-a-lifetime exchange of truth and vulnerability. It wasn't only Eddie who felt changed. Every person in that room would walk out different than they had been when they entered. And the world watching from a distance had no idea what was still to come. The audience sat motionless, uncertain whether to applaud, to weep, or to simply remain in reverent silence. Eddie Murphy dried his eyes, clearly finding it difficult to manage his emotions. President Ibrahim Traoré took a slow, deep breath and leaned back, his gaze unwavering but gentle. "Eddie," he started, "I want to share something with you that I have never disclosed in a setting like this." The crowd seemed to lean forward in unison. "When I was a young man," Traoré said softly, "I stood in a village where children were queued up, not for toys, not for school, but for a single morsel of bread. I can still see their eyes. Not a single one of them complained. They just waited, with the belief that tomorrow would somehow be better." Eddie's lips quivered. The cameras captured every nuance of emotion that crossed his face. Traoré paused. "On that day, I made a promise to myself that I would never let the world forget the look in those eyes. And every choice I make as a leader, every sacrifice, is for those children who are still waiting." The room was utterly still. The sound of a person breathing would have seemed jarring. Eddie finally regained his voice, though it was unsteady. "Man, you have no idea what you've just done to me. I came here thinking we would just laugh, maybe share a few jokes, but you went right for my soul." He looked down, covering his face with his hand, before looking back at Traoré. "I have dedicated my life to making the world laugh, but laughter can't feed a child. It doesn't offer hope to the hungry. Listening to you makes me see that I have more work to do." Traoré reached out gently, resting a hand on Eddie's shoulder. "You have brought joy to the world, Eddie. That is not an insignificant thing. But perhaps now your laughter can also illuminate a path towards something even greater." The audience began to sniffle, the quiet sound of tissues rustling in the background. Eddie's voice broke. "Brother, I did not anticipate crying today." Traoré smiled faintly. "Sometimes, tears are the only language the heart can truly comprehend." The camera lens focused in, capturing a single tear, tracing a path down Eddie's cheek, an image that would soon travel around the world. Word of the exchange spread with incredible speed. Video clips were being shared online before the broadcast. Had even concluded within minutes. Hashtags flooded social media. #TraRendMurphy, Jinghao Tears of Truth, Jinghao Human Connection. But inside that studio, no one was concerned with fame or viral potential. They were simply to men one, a comedian. A president, bound by a moment of raw honesty, Traoré looked directly into Eddie's eyes. "What is most important is not the titles we possess or the acclaim we gather. It is whether we leave this world in a better state than we found it." Eddie nodded slowly, his tears now falling without restraint. "You've just changed me, man. You have truly changed me." The studio audience erupted in applause. It wasn't the kind for a punchline, but the kind that arises from being deeply moved. Some rose to their feet, others dabbed at their eyes. Traoré remained composed, almost tranquil, as if he understood the world was witnessing more than a simple conversation. It was witnessing the planting of a seed of hope, and outside that studio, millions were already being affected in ways they could never have foreseen. The atmosphere in the studio was thick with silence, punctuated only by the quiet whir of the cameras. President Traoré lowered his eyes for a moment, as if drawing strength from a memory deeply ingrained in his being. "When I was just a boy," he said gently, "I watched my own mother forgo her portion of food so that I could have something to eat. She smiled at me that night, even though she had nothing for herself. That image has stayed with me forever." Eddie's eyes immediately welled up. He pressed a hand to his chest and whispered, "Man, that is love. That's true sacrifice." Traoré continued, "Today, as I lead my people, I ask myself, am I giving enough? Am I sacrificing enough? Because authentic leadership is not about wielding power. It's about a love that is strong enough to withstand pain." The audience shifted in their seats, their own emotions starting to unravel. A few tears escaped from the eyes of strangers who had come expecting comedy, not to have their hearts broken open. Eddie shook his head slowly, tears now streaming down his face. "Brother, that is the kind of truth the world needs to hear more." Often, the room remained hushed, as if afraid to disturb the sacredness of the moment. Eddie leaned forward, his voice trembling. "You know, I have played characters my entire life. I've made people laugh. I've helped them forget their problems for a little while. But listening to you now, I feel like I've been running away from something real." Traoré observed him, with calm, compassionate eyes. "What have you been running from, Eddie?" The question landed with more force than anticipated. Eddie blinked quickly, trying to stem the flow of tears. "I grew up poor as well. There were nights my mom worked 3 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet. I used laughter to protect myself. But deep down, I was always that little kid wishing he could do more for her." The audience let out a soft, collective gasp, some clasping their hands. Eddie had never been so unguarded in public. Traoré reached across the space between them, gently taking Eddie's hand. "You already bring her honor every time you bring joy to others. But now, perhaps it's time to use that gift not just for laughter, but for change." Eddie's shoulders shook as he nodded, unable to form words. For the first time in years, the comedian was not the one making others cry. He was crying right along with them. By now, phones throughout the studio were vibrating as live clips swamped the internet. Hashtags trended rapidly. Jinghao Murphy and Truer, Jinghao Tears of Hope, Jinghao Real Leadership. But inside the studio, none of that mattered. The bond between these two men had grown larger than the cameras. Traoré spoke again, his tone steady, his words carefully chosen. "The world may believe that strength is demonstrated by how loudly one speaks or how much wealth one displays. But I am telling you, true strength is the courage to stay human in a world that pressures you to forget your own humanity." Eddie lifted his head, his face streaked with tears. "I feel that, man. I feel that in my soul." The audience rose to their feet, applauding through their own tears. Some clutched their chests, others held hands with the strangers next to them. One young man in the audience whispered, "I came here for a comedy taping, but I am leaving with a changed heart." The camera focused on Eddie and Traoré, both visibly emotional, both joined in a moment the world would always remember. It was no longer just television, it was history being made. The applause eventually subsided, leaving the room enveloped in silence. No one dared to be the one to break it. Eddie sat with his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving. He was no longer the legendary entertainer, he was simply a man, stripped of all his defenses. President Traoré leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "Eddie, the world sees your laughter, but today they also see your heart. And I assure you, showing your heart is not weakness. It is the most profound form of courage." Eddie looked up slowly, his eyes glistening with tears. "You know, I never imagined I would cry like this in front of millions of people. But there's something about your words. They unlocked a part of me I've kept hidden for years." Traoré offered a gentle nod. Perhaps that lock was just waiting for the right key. The audience erupted once more, not with boisterous cheers, but with a slow, rhythmic clap that carried immense weight, the kind of applause that communicates a deep understanding. Eddie let out a breath, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. From him, for the first time in decades, he felt truly seen not for his celebrity, but for his very soul. As the studio lights began to dim, "There is something else I need to share with you, Eddie. When I was 15, I stood in a group of starving children. A stranger gave us a single loaf of bread to be divided among 20 of us. I tore off a piece so minuscule I could barely taste it, yet I promised myself, if I get through this, I will dedicate my life to making sure no child ever feels this kind of hunger again." Eddie's lips parted, his breathing unsteady. "Man, I've known hunger too. Different circumstances. Same pain." Traoré looked at him intently. "Pain may manifest in many ways, but it is what connects us. And when we are brave enough to share it, we transform that pain into power." A woman in the audience sobbed softly, holding her chest. Even the cameraman's eyes were shining with tears. Eddie wiped his face and whispered, "You know what's incredible? You're a president, I'm a comedian. And yet here we are, realizing we have both walked through the same dark valleys." Traoré smiled faintly. "Eddie, titles are irrelevant, Eddie. Hearts are what matter." The room grew still once more. Millions watching online were already hailing it as the most human interview of all time. By the time the host attempted to conclude the segment, nobody wanted it to be over. The air was saturated with raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable emotion. Eddie turned to face the cameras, his voice cracking. "You know, people watch me to have a laugh, but tonight, I want all of you to just feel. Because this man right here," he gestured to Traoré, "reminded me that while laughter is beautiful, the truth can change lives." Traoré placed a hand over his heart. "And your laughter, Eddie, is also a form of truth. You mend souls in ways you may never fully comprehend. Do not underestimate that gift." The crowd rose again, this time in a standing ovation, so thunderous it seemed to reverberate beyond the studio's walls. Phones around the world lit up with live comments. "I'm crying my eyes out. This is history. I will never forget this night." Eddie wiped his tears and whispered, "Thank you, brother. Thank you for reminding me of who I truly am." Traoré simply replied, "We reminded each other." And in that moment, it was no longer an interview. It was a bridge between two souls, witnessed by the entire world. As the camera zoomed in, you could feel a collective global breath being held. Eddie Murphy sat in silence, his eyes still red, his voice shaking. He leaned toward Traoré. "You know, I came here expecting to laugh, to have some light conversation. But what you gave me, brother, you gave me healing." President Traoré lowered his head in a gesture of humility. "Eddie, healing is something that belongs to all of us. Sometimes all it takes is one heart speaking its truth for another to find its peace." The studio was silent, save for the muffled sounds of weeping. From the audience, even viewers at home would later confess that they cried so intensely they forgot they were watching television. For a long moment, Eddie and Traoré just held each other's gaze. There was no script, no political agenda, no performance, just two men revealing their souls in front of millions. The host, visibly moved herself, whispered, This is not just an interview, this is history." And she was correct. Then Traoré shared something that no one was prepared for. "Eddie, there was a point when I believed I had nothing left to give. My people were suffering. The weight of my country was on my shoulders, and I was terrified I would fail them. But one evening, I heard laughter, children laughing in the midst of hardship. That laughter was what reminded me why I had to keep fighting." Eddie's tears flowed without restraint now. He placed a hand on Traoré's shoulder. "That is the same laughter I have tried to bring to people my entire life, but I never conceived of it that way. That laughter could be a form of resistance, of hope, of survival." The audience burst into another wave of applause, with many wiping away tears. Social media was already ablaze with clips. Eddie Murphy meets his match in sincerity. President Traoré proves leaders can touch souls. Eddie whispered, "You have just changed the way I see myself." Traoré smiled softly. "And you have just reminded me why we must never cease to share light, even in the most profound darkness." For once, the comedian, who was never at a loss for words, was rendered speechless, only able to nod as his tears continued to fall. The host finally stood, her voice breaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have all witnessed something tonight that could never be staged. President Ibrahim Traoré and Eddie Murphy have demonstrated the power of truth, respect, and human connection." Eddie wiped his face and turned to the cameras. "If you are watching this right now, don't just watch it. Feel it. Share it. Tell someone you love them today. Don't put it off." Traoré placed a hand over his heart. "The world is changed not by grand speeches, but by moments like this, when we have the courage to simply be human." The studio audience rose to its feet in a thunderous applause, many crying without shame. Online, millions posted messages. "I'm sobbing uncontrollably. This broke me in the best possible way. Traoré is the kind of leader the world needs." As the lights dimmed, Eddie embraced Traoré in a tight hug. "Thank you, brother. Tonight, you didn't just touch my heart, you healed it." And with that, the unforgettable meeting concluded. Not with jokes, not with politics, but with a silence so powerful, it echoed around the globe. Before you move on from this story, I ask you to do something important. If this moment resonated with you, if you felt the tears well up as you listened, then please subscribe, like, and leave a comment below sharing which part of this story affected you the most. Your words are meaningful. Your support helps spread these powerful truths even further. Let's make the world feel this together.